Thank you so much for that context and kind of bringing it back to our local level and talking about jurisdiction. There was a court case that was filed in Oakland federal court. All the plaintiffs were multiple Palestinian organizations, and it sought to hold Biden's regime accountable for its role and complacency in this genocide. And that court case was dismissed, right? Because the judge was like, well, this is out of my jurisdiction. But nonetheless, the judge was very critical of the United States and their role right now. But although this was dismissed, the language basically implored the government to stop assisting in a genocide. So what does this tell us about the role of the U.S. legal system and their ability to keep the White House in check as it pertains to the U.S.'s role internationally?
That's a really big question. Um, Let me start with the sort of importance of that court case. So this case was filed by the Center for Constitutional Rights against the Biden administration, officials in the Biden administration, in a U.S. District Court in Oakland. And they were seeking an injunction to effectively stop the United States from being complicit in Israel's genocide by providing military funding, diplomatic cover, other kind of funding, military weapons, sorry. So they were trying to get an injunction to stop the complicity and also to enjoin the United States to adhere to its obligations under the Genocide Convention to prevent Israel from committing genocide. There is a prevention obligation under the convention, and it applies when a state is aware that another state is effectively committing genocide, and it has it within its power to stop it. And the United States is uniquely positioned to be able to exert influence over Israel to prevent what it is doing inside of Gaza. So that's what the case was seeking, an injunction to end U.S. complicity and to require the U.S. government to prevent Israel from its continuing genocide in Gaza. Last Friday, actually, a few hours after the ICJ decision, the court held a hearing on the request for injunction, and that hearing included witness statements. Statements from individuals inside of Gaza, statements from individuals who had family who were inside of Gaza, statements from experts about the genocide happening inside of Gaza. And that in and of itself, and this was actually broadcast on Zoom. It's on the court's website. So you can actually watch the hearing from beginning to end. I believe it was 3 hours. And that in and of itself was an incredible moment for Palestinians to tell their own story. And this sort of gets to the role of U.S. courts sort of actually generally in the issue of Palestine. The U.S. courts have for a very long time been a site for Israelis or pro-Israeli folks to tell their stories about what's happening. It hasn't really been a venue at all for Palestinians to tell their narratives, to share their experiences, to reflect on their histories, to talk about the emotional and physical consequences of 75 years of settler colonialism and occupation. It's never really been that, the US courts, but it was in this case. And so the ability to tell their stories to a U.S. court, in a U.S. courtroom, in front of a federal judge, broadcast to the world, was in and of itself a really powerful moment. And I think one of the successes of this litigation. Ultimately, as you note, the court, it actually issued its decision, I believe, on Wednesday. It's a relatively short decision. It's 9 pages. Anyone can read it. It's pretty accessible. It ends up dismissing on something called political question. So it dismisses on jurisdictional grounds. But in doing so, it notes that it also believes that there's a plausible basis to think that there's genocide happening by Israel against the Palestinians. And it quotes extensively from the ICJ decision. And it also implores the defendants to effectively do what they can to stop this genocide from the defendants being the U.S. government. So this is a U.S. court decision that also acknowledges genocide happening against the Palestinians, and also acknowledges that the United States has a responsibility here under the Genocide Convention to prevent it, even though the court's hands are bound in ordering the government to do that. So that is certainly not a total victory, because a total victory would have been an injunction. But it is as close to a victory as was possible under the current state of the law. Much like the ICJ didn't issue a ceasefire, but issued a whole bunch of other things. And those are very important victories. This is a victory as well. The U.S. courts and U.S. law, as I alluded to before, and as I wrote about in the article that you quoted earlier, Instruments of Dehumanization for the Boston Review, have by and large been used very effectively by Israel and its allies to promote its narratives, its political perspective on what is happening inside Palestine. And it has been one that has primarily framed the Palestinian journey and effort to seek self-determination as one that is basically just about terrorism and is inherently anti-Semitic. Anyone who supports the Palestinians is a terrorist or is an anti-Semite. Israel and its allies have effectively leveraged U.S. law and the U.S. courts to promote those kinds of narratives. So certainly in the past, U.S. courts have not been a friend to the Palestinians, have not been in any way, shape, or form helpful in the Palestinian effort to seek liberation and achieve liberation. So the courts are not a great venue, generally speaking, for those who want Palestine to be free. But in this case, I think it was used as effectively as it could have been to try and begin to shift the narrative in a way that doesn't just privilege the perspective of Israel.